The bell above the cafe door chimed as Lena Carter stepped inside, pulling her scarf tighter against the biting morning wind. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep, a side effect of back-to-back event decorating gigs that had stretched into the early hours. Christmas season meant double shifts, high-maintenance clients, and barely enough time to eat, let alone rest. Today's lifeline came in the form of caffeine, and she was determined to grab a large caramel latte before heading to another venue. The place was packed, the line snaking almost to the door. The air was thick with the smell of fresh pastries and espresso, and the hum of conversation made it hard to think. Lena shuffled forward inch by inch, rehearsing her order in her head as if it were an important presentation. She didn't trust her brain to improvise, not in this state. Finally, she reached the counter, ordered, and stepped aside to wait. She could almost taste the sugary sweetness already. The barista set a steaming cup on the pickup counter and called out, "Large caramel latte for Lena." Before she could react, a man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit stepped forward and grabbed it. "Excuse me," she started, but he was already walking toward the door, sipping as if it belonged to him. Something inside Lena snapped. "Hey, that's my drink." She marched toward him, her voice rising over the background chatter. He turned, eyebrows slightly raised, and for a moment she was struck by his height, the sharp angles of his jaw, and the way his presence seemed to silence the room. But the flicker of intimidation only fueled her irritation. "You know," she continued, planting herself in front of him, "some of us actually wait our turn. But I guess when you're dripping money from every pore, you think lines don't apply to you." The man blinked, clearly surprised by her outburst. He glanced at the cup in his hand, then back at her, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," he said calmly, his voice deep and even. "I didn't realize it wasn't mine." "Of course you didn't," Lena shot back, ignoring the faint heat in her cheeks. "Why bother checking when you can just take whatever you want? Must be nice living in that bubble." He didn't argue. He didn't even look annoyed. If anything, there was a faint curve to his lips, like he was privately amused. He simply handed her the drink. "Here." "My mistake," he said, then stepped aside. Lena snatched it, muttering under her breath as she stalked out, the heat of embarrassment mixing with the caffeine-scented steam. The man watched her go, the amusement never leaving his eyes. Outside, Lena took a long sip and tried to shake off the encounter, already thinking about the decorations she had to hang before noon. She didn't know, not yet, that she had just snapped at Damien Holt, the reclusive heir to the Holt international fortune, a man who was used to being invisible by choice, until she made him impossible to ignore. Lena Carter's apartment was the kind of place where every inch had to work twice as hard. The kitchen doubled as a storage area for event props, crates of silk flowers stacked beside the fridge, spools of ribbon and fairy lights crammed into a cabinet that once held cereal. She lived in the small two-bedroom with her younger brother, Eli, who was currently stretched out on the couch, a blanket pulled over his thin frame. Eli was recovering from surgery after a sports injury that had derailed his college basketball dreams. Without their parents, who had passed away within a year of each other, Lena had stepped into both caretaker and provider roles. Between hospital bills, lingering debts from their parents' estate, and rent, her income evaporated before she ever saw it. That was why she worked like she did. By day, she was an event decorator, stringing up crystal chandeliers in ballrooms, arranging flowers in centerpieces worth more than her monthly rent, draping silk over tables for galas hosted by people who didn't know the meaning of budget. By night, she picked up whatever she could, waitressing at a wine bar, hand-painting signs for weddings, even helping a friend's cleaning service when desperate. She didn't mind hard work. What she minded were the people who looked right through her while she was doing it. The wealthy clients who treated her like part of the furniture, who complained about the color of the linens while tipping barely enough for gas money. Over time, she'd built a thick skin, but certain things still set her off. Entitlement. Disrespect. The assumption that her time and energy were worth less because she wasn't born into money. Which was why that morning at the cafe had been a perfect storm. She was running on fumes, she'd been yelled at by a client for breathing too close to a floral arch, and then Mr. Fancy Suit had swooped in and taken her drink like the universe was testing her patience. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table with her best friend Maya, who had dropped by with takeout. Maya worked in PR and had a knack for reading people, something Lena appreciated when she needed to vent. "So you just let him have it?" Maya asked, eyebrows raised as she took a bite of dumpling. "Oh, I absolutely let him have it," Lena said, stabbing her fork into a piece of broccoli. "I told him exactly what I thought about rich guys who think they can do whatever they want. And you know what? He didn't even fight back. Just stood there looking smug." Maya tilted her head. "Smug or amused? What's the difference?" Lena muttered. "The difference is, if he was amused, you might have been talking to someone who isn't used to hearing no, or being called out." Maya took a sip of her soda. "And if that's the case, you might want to hope you never see him again." Lena scoffed. "Please. What's the worst that could happen? It's not like I yelled at a millionaire." Maya's lips curved into a sly smile. "You'd be surprised. This is the city, millionaires are everywhere. You just don't notice most of them because they're not flashy. Well, until you're yelling in their faces." Lena laughed, shaking her head. "If that guy's a millionaire, then I'm the Queen of England." Eli stirred from the couch and called out, "Do I get to be a prince then?" Lena smiled at him, but Maya's words lingered in the back of her mind. She brushed them off, because really, what were the odds? But if she'd known how wrong she was, she might have swallowed her pride right then and there. 3 days after the cafe incident, Lena's phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number just as she was halfway through wrangling a stubborn roll of silver tablecloth into her supply cabinet. She almost let it go to voicemail, but the words "double your usual rate" made her perk up instantly. The caller was a woman with a crisp, polite voice who introduced herself as Ms. Ray from the Holt Foundation. She explained they were hosting an exclusive charity gala at a private estate and needed a full event decoration setup in less than a week. Everything, flowers, lighting, table design, stage backdrop, had to be perfect. The previous decorator had dropped out last minute, and someone had recommended Lena. Lena blinked at the details. Double pay for rush work? That's generous. "It's also urgent," Ms. Ray replied smoothly. "Are you available to meet tomorrow morning at the venue?" Lena glanced at her calendar. Her schedule was already a game of Tetris, but this job could wipe out nearly 2 months of debt. "Yes. Absolutely. I'll be there." The next day, she pulled up to the address Ms. Ray had texted her, and nearly choked. The venue wasn't just a luxury estate, it looked like a magazine spread come to life. Tall wrought iron gates opened to a driveway lined with manicured hedges and fountains. The mansion beyond had sprawling terraces, massive windows, and the kind of understated elegance that screamed old money. She parked her van and stepped out, feeling a little underdressed in her dark jeans and work blouse. The front door opened, and a man stepped into the sunlight. Her stomach dropped. Damien Holt. The man from the cafe. The one she'd accused, loudly, of being an arrogant rich jerk. For a wild moment, she considered turning around, getting back into her van, and pretending she'd gotten lost. But before she could retreat, Damien spotted her. His expression didn't shift into anger or annoyance. Instead, a flicker of recognition passed over his features, followed by something else. Amusement. "Ms. Carter." His voice was calm, deep, and far too composed for her liking. She froze halfway up the steps. Yes. That's me." He extended a hand as if they were meeting for the first time. "Damien Holt. Thank you for coming on such short notice." Lena's mouth went dry. She waited for the part where he said, "And now you can leave, because I don't hire people who publicly insult me." But instead, he stepped aside to let her in. The mansion's interior was every bit as breathtaking as the outside. Soaring ceilings, gleaming marble floors, and light streaming in from tall windows overlooking the gardens. Standing in the grand foyer was a silver-haired woman in an elegant but simple dress. "Lena, this is my mother, Margaret Holt," Damien said. Margaret smiled warmly and took Lena's hand. "You must be the decorator. I've heard wonderful things about your work." Lena blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, thank you. I'll do my best for the gala." "I'm sure you will," Margaret said. "We want this event to feel intimate yet elegant. And I'd prefer you handle it personally, no delegating to assistants. You have an eye for detail that I think will make all the difference." Lena nodded quickly, still trying to process what was happening. "Of course. I'll personally oversee every element." Damien stood slightly to the side, watching with that same small, knowing smile. It wasn't smug exactly, but it made her skin prickle. Like he was silently reminding her of their last meeting, but choosing not to mention it, for now. As Margaret began explaining her vision for the gala, Lena scribbled notes in her planner, doing her best to focus. But every time she glanced up, Damien was still there, leaning casually against the doorframe, his gaze steady. Not hostile, not dismissive, just observant. It was unsettling. And a little embarrassing. By the time the meeting wrapped up, Lena's head was spinning. She had a massive job ahead of her, a client who clearly valued precision, and a week to pull it off. But the bigger problem was Damien Holt, the man she'd misjudged so spectacularly. Because if he was going to keep looking at her like that, she wasn't sure whether she should be nervous or curious. Over the next several days, Lena practically lived at the Holt estate. Every corner of the property seemed to demand something: floral arrangements for the terrace, lanterns for the garden path, crystal centerpieces that had to be unpacked and checked for chips. She threw herself into the work, determined to impress Margaret and prove she could deliver, but there was one variable she hadn't accounted for: Damien. No matter where she went, he seemed to materialize. Sometimes it was coincidence, like finding him already in the ballroom when she arrived to measure the tables. Other times, it felt intentional. He'd stroll in while she was knee-deep in unpacking, lean against a doorway, and offer a comment that made her pulse jump. "Careful with those glasses, Lena. Wouldn't want to bill me for damages twice in 1 week," he said one afternoon, his mouth curving in a half-smile. She glanced up sharply, catching the glint of mischief in his eyes. "Very funny. I don't recall breaking anything at the cafe." "True," he said, taking a slow sip from his coffee cup. "But you did dent my ego. Much harder to fix." She rolled her eyes and returned to work, but she couldn't stop the heat from creeping into her cheeks. Margaret, on the other hand, was all warmth and sincerity. She'd drop by while Lena worked, chatting about everything from favorite flowers to childhood hobbies. But every so often, her questions veered into personal territory. "So, are you married?" Margaret asked one morning, settling into a chair while Lena arranged roses in tall vases. "No," Lena replied, keeping her tone light. "Just me and my work for now." Margaret tilted her head, as if filing the information away. "You must have incredible focus then. Not many young women your age can manage a project of this scale so calmly." Lena smiled, though inside she was wondering why Margaret seemed so invested. The real surprise, though, was Damien's quiet helpfulness. For someone who looked like he could pay 10 people to handle his chores, he had an irritating habit of pitching in. When 2 of the caterer's assistants started arguing over where to unload supplies, Damien appeared out of nowhere, diffused the tension in 2 sentences, and helped them carry crates inside. Another time, Lena was struggling to balance a tall floral arch in the garden when a gust of wind sent it toppling. She braced for impact, only for strong hands to catch it just before it crashed. "Got it," Damien said, steadying the arch while she hurried to secure the base. She looked up at him, a little breathless. "You're surprisingly useful." He chuckled. "Don't tell anyone. I've got a reputation to maintain." Moments like these chipped away at her original impression of him. Yes, he had that air of someone used to getting his way, but he wasn't condescending. If anything, he seemed to go out of his way to make her job easier, without making a big show of it. Still, every now and then, he'd slip in a subtle reminder of their first meeting. A raised eyebrow when she gave instructions to staff. A smirk when she double-checked her notes. As if to say, "I remember how you judged me, but I'm not holding it against you. Yet." By the end of the 4th day, Lena was unsettled. She'd come here to do a job, not to reevaluate her opinion of Damien Holt. But between Margaret's almost maternal interest and Damien's unexpected blend of teasing and kindness, she found herself thinking about him even after she'd left the estate. And that was dangerous. It started with tea. On the 3rd afternoon of preparations, just as Lena was setting up an arrangement of peonies, Margaret appeared in the doorway with a gentle smile. "You've been on your feet for hours. Come, have a cup of tea with me." Lena hesitated, glancing at her half-finished centerpiece. "I don't want to fall behind." "5 minutes," Margaret interrupted, her tone kind but unmistakably firm. Work always looks better after a pause. Reluctantly, Lena followed her into the sunlit conservatory. The space was filled with orchids and the faint scent of jasmine. Margaret poured tea into delicate china cups and began speaking about her late husband, a man she described as both stubborn as a mule and the love of my life. "You remind me a little of him," Margaret said with a soft laugh. "Not in looks, of course, but in spirit. He had this unwillingness to let things slide." Lena smiled politely, unsure how to respond. "I suppose I do like things done right." "I can see that." Margaret's eyes were warm, but Lena felt an odd sense of being measured. Over the next few days, the tea invitations became routine. Sometimes they were in the conservatory, other times in a cozy sitting room overlooking the gardens. Margaret spoke of Damien's childhood, her own years running charity events, and the importance of choosing the right people to trust. But there was always an undercurrent. Lena began to notice the way Margaret's gaze lingered when she spoke to the serving staff, or how she'd watch from a distance when Lena bent down to help a lost child find their parents during a guest walkthrough. One afternoon, Lena caught her smiling faintly as she watched from across the terrace. When their eyes met, Margaret said, "You're not afraid to speak up. That's rare these days." It was such a strange comment that Lena could only laugh. "I think my brother would tell you I speak up too much." Margaret tilted her head thoughtfully. "Better too much than too little. Silence often hides regret." Lena brushed it off as one of those poetic remarks older women sometimes made, not realizing it was part of something more deliberate. What she couldn't know, was that Margaret was already fitting pieces together in her mind. She'd seen plenty of women orbit Damien over the years, most drawn to his name and fortune. Lena was different. She didn't simper, didn't seem overly impressed, and, most tellingly, didn't seem to care whether Damien liked her or not. Margaret found that refreshing. As Lena returned to work after yet another tea break, she thought of Margaret simply as a gracious, slightly eccentric employer. Margaret, on the other hand, was already wondering if she'd just found the kind of woman who could keep her son grounded, and if this gala might be the perfect stage to test the idea. The night of the charity gala shimmered with gold and candlelight. Lena's decorations, hours of labor, sore fingers, and meticulous planning, transformed the sprawling Holt estate into a fairytale setting. Twinkling lights cascaded down marble columns, roses and orchids trailed from crystal vases, and the fountain in the center courtyard glittered with floating candles. Guests murmured their approval as they arrived, their champagne glasses catching the light. For the first time all week, Lena allowed herself a breath of relief. She was tucking a stray ribbon behind the dessert table when the soft chime of a microphone filled the air. Damien stood on the small stage at the far end of the garden, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. His voice carried easily, warm and controlled. "Tonight isn't just about raising funds," he began, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "It's about how the right people, often when least expected, can turn a challenge into something extraordinary." Lena's head snapped up, her stomach flipping. "Is he?" Sure enough, Damien's eyes flicked briefly toward her before he continued. "Some meetings, even if they start unexpectedly, can lead to opportunities worth remembering." A ripple of polite laughter moved through the audience. Lena rolled her eyes, but she couldn't quite stop the tug of a smile. Subtle, Holt. Real subtle. As the applause rose, she busied herself with refilling the hors d'oeuvres trays, determined to stay invisible. But invisibility wasn't in the cards. Vanessa Devereaux swept into the dessert area like she owned the air around her. Tall, dripping in diamonds, and wearing a gown that seemed designed to outshine the floral arrangements, she stopped directly in front of Lena. "Well," Vanessa drawled, her voice just loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "isn't this charming?" The hired help hiding in the corner. Lena froze for a moment, then straightened. "Just making sure everything is perfect for the guests." Vanessa's smile was sharp. "Of course. I suppose you do need to make yourself useful somehow. Not everyone can contribute in more meaningful ways." The implication landed like a slap, and several guests nearby glanced over. Lena felt a flicker of heat in her chest, but her voice stayed even. "With all due respect, Ms. Devereaux, without the staff, there wouldn't be a gala at all. These events don't just magically appear, people work hard to make them happen." There was a subtle shift in the air. Some guests looked uncomfortable, others clearly enjoyed the brewing tension. Vanessa's brows arched, her red lips curving into a mock-sympathetic smile. "Well," she said sweetly, "I suppose everyone needs their place." Before Lena could decide whether to respond, a deeper voice cut through the murmur. "I couldn't agree more," Damien said as he stepped into the circle of onlookers. His tone was polite, but there was an unmistakable steel beneath it. "And Lena's place tonight is as one of the people who made this event possible. Frankly, I think she's earned more thanks than most of us here." Vanessa blinked, caught off guard. "Damien, He didn't let her finish. "In fact," he continued smoothly, "if you enjoyed the atmosphere tonight, and I think everyone has, you might want to thank her personally before you leave." A ripple of polite applause broke out from the guests within earshot. Vanessa's smile tightened, and she muttered something about needing to check on the silent auction before slipping away. Lena stood frozen for a second, then exhaled slowly. "You didn't have to do that," she murmured, keeping her voice low so only he could hear. "Didn't I?" Damien's mouth curved in that infuriating half-smile. "Consider it repayment for the coffee incident." Despite herself, Lena felt her lips twitch upward. "You have a strange sense of debt." Before Damien could reply, a soft clap drew their attention. Margaret stood a few feet away, her eyes crinkled with approval. She didn't say a word, but the look she gave Lena was warm, almost proud. As the music swelled and the guests returned to their mingling, Lena felt something shift, not just in the room, but inside her. She was still just the decorator, still the help in the eyes of some. But tonight, she hadn't backed down. And Damien Holt had made sure everyone knew it. 2 days after the gala, Lena was surprised to receive a call from Margaret Holt's personal assistant. The message was simple and polite. "Mrs. Holt would like to invite you to lunch at her private club." Lena almost declined. It wasn't that she disliked Margaret, in fact, she respected her. But lunch with the matriarch of the Holt family sounded like the kind of situation where you could accidentally agree to sell your soul in between courses. Still, curiosity and politeness won out. The club was one of those places that seemed to breathe old money. Crystal chandeliers hung over velvet booths, and the waiters moved like they were gliding rather than walking. Margaret sat at a corner table with a view of the manicured gardens beyond, a silk scarf draped elegantly over her shoulders. "Lena," she greeted warmly, rising slightly. "I'm so glad you could join me." "Thank you for inviting me," Lena replied, taking her seat. The waiter appeared instantly with sparkling water and a menu thick enough to be a coffee table book. The conversation began harmlessly, compliments about the gala decorations, a passing mention of Damien's speech, a question about Lena's work before joining Holt Events. Margaret listened intently, her hands folded, her gaze steady. It wasn't until after the first course, a delicate seafood bisque, that Margaret set a spoon down and leaned forward slightly. "Lena," she began, her voice calm but deliberate, "I've been looking for someone like you for Damien, and for our family." Lena nearly choked on her sip of water. "I'm sorry, what?" Margaret smiled as if she'd merely commented on the weather. "You have a steadiness about you. You don't fawn over him like most women do, and you're not intimidated by our name. That's rare." Lena blinked. "With all due respect, Mrs. Holt, I'm not looking for romance, especially not with a man like Damien." Margaret's expression didn't falter. If anything, her smile deepened. "That's exactly why you might be perfect." Lena laughed nervously. "I think you might be overestimating me. Damien and we're barely civil half the time." "And yet," Margaret said, tilting her head, "you don't let him walk over you. You challenge him, but not to win, you challenge him to do better. He needs that, more than he realizes." Lena shook her head. "I'm here to do a job. Nothing more." Margaret reached for her teacup, her eyes still fixed on Lena. "Jobs end. Character doesn't. I've lived long enough to know when two people have the kind of friction that can turn into something else." Lena forced a smile, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. But as lunch continued, Margaret's words echoed in her head. By the time they said their goodbyes at the club entrance, Lena still felt rattled. She had walked in expecting polite small talk. She had walked out with a proposition she wasn't sure she wanted, or could entirely ignore. Damien found Lena in the quiet side garden of the estate, where the last of the event staff were packing up crates of floral arrangements and lighting fixtures. She was scribbling final notes in her planner, her brow furrowed in the same concentrated way it had been when she had been stringing garlands earlier in the week. "I owe you an explanation," Damien began, his voice carrying the calm warmth of someone who'd been rehearsing this conversation in his head. Lena looked up, wary. "About what?" "That your mother thinks I'm some project for you." A faint smirk touched his lips, but his eyes stayed steady. "No. About the cafe. I recognized you the moment you walked into the estate that first day. And I'll admit, I didn't tell you because I was curious what you'd do if you didn't know my name." Lena's pen froze on the page. "So you were just standing there letting me yell at you for sport?" Damien shook his head. "Not for sport. For honesty. In my world, people bend themselves into knots trying to please me. They tell me what they think I want to hear. You didn't care who I was, you told me exactly what you thought. And it was refreshing." She scoffed, crossing her arms. "Refreshing? Most men in your position would call that disrespect." "Most men in my position," Damien replied evenly, "are terrified of honesty because it forces them to look at themselves. You didn't even hesitate. That takes guts." Lena shifted in her seat, uncomfortable under his unflinching gaze. "You make it sound like I'm some rare commodity to be bought and placed in your collection." His expression softened. "I'm not asking you to be part of anything you don't want. I'm not running a matchmaking scheme. My mother, well, she sees qualities in people and sometimes gets carried away. But me, I just wanted you to know that I respect you. And I'd like the chance to show you I'm not the entitled jerk you think I am." She narrowed her eyes, still guarded. "And if I say no?" Damien smiled faintly. "Then I'll still admire your work from a distance, and you'll never hear another word about it. But if you say yes, even just a coffee, I'll prove I'm more than a last name and a bank account." Lena studied him for a long moment, searching for cracks in the calm confidence. There were none. He stood there, hands in his pockets, not pushing, not charming, just waiting. Finally, she glanced back down at her planner. "Coffee isn't a contract," she muttered. "No," Damien agreed, the corner of his mouth lifting. "It's just coffee." But the way he said it made her think it might be more than that. Lena had come to the children's hospital that Saturday morning with a simple goal: drop off a box of donated books collected from a community drive. She wasn't expecting to see Damien there. He was kneeling on the floor of the brightly painted playroom, building a lopsided block tower with a little boy who was missing most of his hair. His suit jacket was nowhere in sight. Instead, he wore a plain navy sweater and rolled-up sleeves. No photographers hovered nearby. No PR team lingered in the background. Just Damien, laughing softly when the boy knocked over the tower and squealed for them to start again. Lena lingered in the doorway, unseen for a moment. She remembered all the smug assumptions she'd made about him in that cafe, the entitled heir with too much money and too little empathy. But here he was, quietly blending in, doing work that no one outside this room would ever hear about. When he finally noticed her, his smile widened, but it wasn't the polished, social one he wore at events. "Hey," he said, standing and brushing a stray block off his sweater. "You here to read to the kids or just dropping by?" "Dropping by," she admitted. "I didn't know you volunteered here." He shrugged like it wasn't worth mentioning. "I come when I can. Fundraisers help, but time matters too." They spent the next hour together, Damien guiding her through the hospital's small rooftop garden, introducing her to the staff, explaining how the charity events actually funneled into specific programs. Not once did he bring up his last name or his business empire. Over the next few weeks, their paths began crossing outside of work more often. Sometimes it was intentional, a quick lunch at a corner cafe, coffee breaks squeezed between meetings, even an aimless walk through the park when they both had an unexpected free hour. Other times, it felt accidental but easy, like they were falling into the same rhythm without trying. They talked about safe topics at first: the best place for croissants in the city, embarrassing work mishaps, a debate over whether pineapple belonged on pizza. But slowly, the conversations deepened. Damien spoke about his father's absence during his childhood and how Margaret had worked to keep the family grounded despite wealth and social pressures. Lena shared fragments of her own past, Losing her father young, watching her mother work 2 jobs, how she'd learned to be fiercely independent because relying on people rarely ended well. One rainy afternoon, they sat in a small cafe by the window, sipping hot chocolate instead of coffee because Damien had insisted it was the only proper drink for a day like this. He told her about a little girl at the hospital who had reminded him of his younger sister, stubborn, funny, endlessly curious, and how she'd once told him she wanted to be the boss of the whole building when she grew up. Lena found herself smiling more than she wanted to admit. He was still from a world she didn't understand, a world of boardrooms, gala dinners, and inherited influence. But here, in these quiet moments, none of that seemed to matter. And yet, it did matter. The closer they got, the more she felt the line she was crossing. Falling for someone like Damien wasn't just a risk of heartbreak, it was stepping into a life that could swallow hers whole. That night, as she lay in bed replaying the sound of his laugh and the way his eyes softened when he listened to her, she realized she was already letting her guard down. The question was whether she had the courage to see where that would lead. Lena's phone buzzed before she was even fully awake. At first, she thought it was an alarm she'd forgotten to turn off, but then the messages began to pour in, co-workers, friends from her old neighborhood, even an aunt she hadn't spoken to in years. Have you seen this? Don't read the comments. Is this true? Her stomach dropped. She opened one link, and there it was. Heir to McKinnon fortune spotted with mystery woman. Is she the city's newest gold digger? The photos were grainy but clear enough. One of her and Damien leaving the hospital fundraiser together, another of them laughing over coffee, and the worst, him touching her elbow in that casual, almost protective way. Out of context, the pictures painted a story the tabloids were eager to tell. The article dredged up details from her life she hadn't shared with Damien, her modest apartment, her second job during college, even her mother's years of financial struggle. Twisted into a narrative, it made her look calculating, as if befriending Damien had been a strategic move. By the time she finished reading, her hands were shaking. Privacy was one thing she'd always guarded fiercely, and now it felt like strangers had ripped the door right off its hinges. She was halfway through typing a message to Damien. We need to stop seeing each other. This isn't worth it. When a knock sounded at her door. When she opened it, Damien was there, holding the folded tabloid in one hand. His jaw was set, his hair damp from the misty morning air. I saw it, he said without preamble. I'm fine, she lied. And it's fine. Really. Let's just stop giving them something to talk about. Lena, no. His voice was firm in a way she rarely heard from him. He stepped inside before she could protest, dropping the tabloid on her kitchen counter. You didn't do anything wrong, and I'm not going to let them chase you off like this. She crossed her arms. They're not after you, Damien. They're after me. I'm the easy headline. They're after us, he corrected. And I don't care what they print. If I walk away now, they win. And you'd be letting lies decide the truth about you. Her throat tightened. You don't understand what it's like to have your life picked apart like this. His eyes softened, but his voice stayed steady. Actually, I do. I've had my whole life under a microscope since I could walk. The only difference is, I've learned not to give their words power. And I'm not going to stand here and let them tear down one of the best people I've ever met. She blinked at him, caught between disbelief and something dangerously close to gratitude. Margaret likes you because of who you are, Damien went on. Not because of what you wear or where you live. My family doesn't need another socialite. They need someone real. And so do I. The words hung in the air, heavier than she was ready to unpack. Lena hesitated, searching for a reason to keep her distance. I don't want to be a project for you to fix or protect. You're not, Damien said simply. But if someone's going to stand beside me in my world, I need them to know I'll stand beside them too. Every time. For the first time that morning, the knot in her chest loosened. It didn't erase the sting of the article, but it made her wonder, maybe walking away wasn't the only way to protect herself. The McKinnon estate was quieter than usual that evening. The gathering was small, just close family and a handful of friends, which was exactly why Lena had agreed to come. She'd learned to navigate Damien's world in measured steps, and this felt like a safe one. Margaret had insisted on hosting a simple family dinner, though Lena had her doubts about Margaret's definition of simple. The long dining table was adorned with fresh flowers, the kind of arrangement that looked plucked straight from a magazine spread, and a string quartet played softly in the background. Halfway through dessert, Damien rose from his seat. Lena thought he was going to refill his glass of wine, but instead, he walked around the table until he was standing in front of her. He smiled, that familiar mix of warmth and mischief in his eyes. "You know," he began, "I've been thinking about the first time we met." Lena groaned lightly, already sensing where this was headed. "Don't," she warned playfully. "Oh, I'm absolutely going there," Damien said, grinning wider. "You, a stranger, stormed into a cafe, ordered coffee like you were waging a war, and then proceeded to yell at me because you thought I was cutting in line." The table erupted in laughter, including Margaret, who was practically glowing. Damien's voice softened as he went on. "And in that moment, I thought, here's someone who isn't afraid to speak her mind, even if it means yelling at McKinnon. You didn't care who I was. You just cared about what was right. And that," he paused, his eyes locking on hers, "is exactly why I fell in love with you." Before Lena could process the shift in tone, Damien reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. The room seemed to hold its breath. He knelt down, opening the box to reveal a ring that was elegant but understated, nothing gaudy or flashy, just beautiful in its simplicity. "Lena," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion, "you've turned my life upside down in the best possible way. You've taught me that love isn't about status or headlines, it's about showing up for each other, even when the world tries to pull us apart. I don't want a future without you in it. Will you marry me?" For a moment, all Lena could do was stare, her heart pounding. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught Margaret's expression, proud, joyful, and maybe just a little smug, as if she'd been waiting for this all along. "Yes," Lena said finally, the word breaking into a smile. "Yes, I will." The table erupted in applause, Margaret dabbing at her eyes while Damien slipped the ring onto her finger. He stood, pulling her into a hug that felt less like a fairy tale ending and more like the beginning of something real, something they'd built together without either of them having to compromise who they truly were. And for Lena, that made it perfect. 1 year later, the bustling hum of voices, clinking glasses, and soft music filled the ballroom. It wasn't a McKinnon event this time, it was Lena's. Her own event planning company had taken off faster than she ever imagined. She'd built her client list from scratch, poured herself into every detail, and refused to let Damien's name be her shortcut. He'd respected that from day one, offering silent, behind-the-scenes support only when she asked, which was rare. Tonight, she watched her team move effortlessly, each moment unfolding exactly as planned. It wasn't just a job anymore, it was proof that she could thrive in a world she once thought she didn't belong to. Across the room, Margaret was in her element, mingling with guests and, as usual, telling her favorite story. "And there she was," Margaret said, animated as ever, scolding Damien in a cafe because she thought he was cutting in line. "I swear, that was the moment I knew she was the one." Lena rolled her eyes with a grin as she caught snippets of the tale. Margaret told it at least once at every gathering, embellishing it a little each time. But Lena didn't mind. Somewhere along the way, those retellings had become a badge of honor, proof of where they'd started and how far they'd come. Damien appeared at her side, carrying 2 champagne flutes. He handed one to her without a word, and they stepped out onto the balcony for a brief escape from the crowd. The night air was cool, the city lights stretching endlessly in the distance. "So," Damien said, leaning against the railing, "do you think fate had anything to do with that coffee shop incident?" Lena smirked. "Fate? No. Poor Q management. Absolutely." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You're impossible." "And yet, here we are," she replied, tilting her glass toward him. They clinked their flutes, sipping in comfortable silence for a moment. Inside, the laughter and music carried on, but out here it was just them, the same 2 people who had collided over coffee order, now partners in something far bigger than either of them could have predicted. Damien glanced at her, a trace of that first meeting mischief still in his eyes. "You know, I still have that receipt from the cafe," he said. "You kept a coffee receipt?" she asked, laughing. "Of course. It's the most expensive cup of coffee I've ever bought, and worth every penny." Lena shook her head, but her heart was warm. This was their life now, full of small moments, shared jokes, and the kind of partnership she'd once thought only existed in other people's stories. They turned back toward the ballroom, hand in hand. Whatever the future held, Lena knew they'd face it together, not as a millionaire and a girl from outside his world, but as equals who had chosen each other every step of the way. And for both of them, that was the best kind of happy ending.